There could be someone who has a personality cult of sorts. They are admired by millions, but any power that they exerted would have to be tempered by empathy, and they'd have to have humility, because authoritarianism is about arrogance.
Hey, humans! Welcome to another edition of Demystifying Science, where we give a bigger picture to human happenings.
On the agenda for today is a discussion of politics, power, and control, inspired by a recent conversation with Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a scholar on authoritarian rule at NYU.
We became interested in this topic after watching you creatures react to the pandemic that's unfolding beneath you. Two groups of people have emerged, one that's more than happy to submit to top-down restrictions on personal freedom, and another that insisted safety isn't worth the infringement on life, liberty, and pursuit of whatever it is you pursue. Bars? Parties?
Widespread lockdowns have triggered fears that the world is taking a turn towards authoritarian rule, a government system that's marked by a lack of democratic and free elections, a codified hostility towards threat to the social order, a lack of accountability, and party loyalists at every turn.
No one really voted on what to do about the pandemic, so it makes a lot of sense that people in democratic nations are freaked out about the sheer power of their government to dictate their daily activities, as well as its lack of compassion, since lockdowns have threatened the financial stability of thousands in the name of safety.
Perhaps it's an impolitic time to point this out, but democratic government is a freak exception to basically the entirety of human history. The idea of democracy, that the people rule themselves rather than allowing a king or other central figure to do so, has been around since the time of Sparta and Athens, but the number of democratic institutions over the years remained in single digits for almost 2 millennia.
It's worth pointing out that democracy in action throughout history has never been a pure form of the ideal. Slavery was commonplace, as was restrictions on voting to the ruling elite, and almost all nations have practiced representational rather than direct democracy. It's this Republican variant of democracy that remains standard throughout the developed world today.
Emergence of Republican governance after millennia of absence had a lot to do with the geopolitical changes that the world was going through during the 19th century. The idea of a country rather than an empire was in itself a reflection of the strangeness of the political transition that was happening on Earth. After a few hundred years of colonialism, the world had been sliced and diced into various empires, and as the high water mark of those empires came and went, the nation-state was left in the aftermath.
This is in line with what Dr. Ben-Ghiat says about the 1920s being the start of autocratic rule. As nations emerged from the collapsing empires, they were forced to develop their own governments in a global context for the first time. And even as some countries embraced democratic ideals, others were corrupted by dictators and their self-interested associates. The century of strong men had begun.
There's nothing bad about a strong male figure at the helm, but strength without compassion is pretty much a recipe for ruin. The climate that breeds strongman rule, according to those who study it, is characterized by widespread fear, desperation, and anxiety. The worst autocrats over the course of the last century, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, all came to power because they managed to parlay the struggle of an entire country into political will.
The 20th century despots were very effective at playing on endemic frustrations during long periods of economic hardships in those countries. Hitler came to power during the interwar period where Germany was dealing with extreme social instability following reparation-driven hyperinflation. To give context to what that means, you could get $1 for 160 Deutschmarks in 1922, but by the end of 1923, that had risen to 4.2 trillion Deutschmarks to the dollar.
Exactly. People were poor, and they were cold, and they were hungry. They were nationalistic to begin with, let's make that clear. Only those with German blood were allowed to be citizens, even during the Weimar Republic. So when someone came along and suggested that leaning into their nationalism, getting rid of the degenerate Jews, gays, and gypsies would solve all their problems, they were more than happy to go along with anyone who promised salvation, no matter what the cost.
You see a similar sort of thing play out in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution, where peasants were starving, the economy was cratering, and factory workers were going on strike because they couldn't even buy bread. All while the elite czarist rulers were obliviated in their amber palaces. The ideas of Marx, such as repossessing the means of production from the wealthy, found an absolutely perfect audience.
While the Russians dealt with their revolution, another strongman was coming to power in China. Mao Zedong, founding member of the Chinese Communist Party, had plenty of eager devotees for Marx's ideas among the peasant class. That's because in pre-revolution China, 10% of the farmers possessed nearly 70% of the land. The rest, as they say, was a long and bloody story.
Is that what they say?
It's what they should say if they don't. Those three are estimated to have killed 62 million people over the course of their time in power. And it all started because their audiences were swayed by the promise of a better life, with no mention of compassion. Analyzing the rhetoric of a leader when you're already exhausted and afraid can be difficult. And it's also a case of motivated reasoning, where people convince themselves that their bad circumstances justify otherwise unthinkable tactics.
What's a little creepy is that there's a pretty significant fraction of humans who will do anything if an authority figure tells them to. Stanley Milgram demonstrated this effect through a series of experiments where he showed that 79% of his experimental subjects were willing to shock someone to death at the direction of a scientist in a white coat with a clipboard.
Remind me to get some white coats before we get to Earth.
Check. It would be a really effective strategy. Even in the US today, 70% of experimental participants were willing to go on shocking someone past the point of them screaming in pain. Now that I think about it, how are we sure this isn't just measuring people's faith in research science rather than authority?
There is only one way to find out. When we get to Earth, we'll get a politician costume for testing purposes.
Sounds good.
How do you figure people get to be so malleable that they would behave that way?
It seems like a damaged information ecology where levels of mistrust and conspiratorial thinking go through the roof makes people want to be ruled by someone who promises answers. They want an economic and social life raft, not nuance.
Living in fear causes a cascading reaction that activates the fight or flight response at a constant level, which means that people's brains actually change. They lose their ability to make well-reasoned, emotionally discharged decisions. Instead, everything is always reactive, a panicked, stormy attempt to get out ahead of the problem that they can't actually get a clear perspective on.
So the despot comes to power on a wave of emotion, and then as soon as they have their hands on the levers of power, they destabilize opposition and enforce loyalty through fear, surveillance, and cronyism. Those who are loyal to the strongman come away with their life intact and riches of corruption in their pocket, while those who oppose the vice grip on power unaccountably vanish.
Modern versions of this kind of centralized control are aggravated by the presence of an enormously powerful surveillance state, like those supported by the technologies being developed in China, Israel, and the United States. It's hard to defy a strongman when surveillance is so effective that opposition leaders are either killed or imprisoned before any momentum can build.
This kind of control, where freedom of expression is outlawed, where only a narrow band of opinions are allowed in public discourse, destroys the social wealth of a country for generations. You know, evolution doesn't always take eons. Just the same way a wild fox can be domesticated over a few generations, so can the spirit of a people be worn away. Artistic expression gets stifled, morality is corrupted for political gain, and people lose the ability to stand up for what's right because they're busy protecting themselves and their families.
Yeah, survivors of authoritarian regimes often express a deep shame at what's transpired around them, seemingly without their agreement, without their consultation even. Because even the smallest act of resistance or even neutrality can be viewed as insubordination, free expression slowly withers and dies. Since this is a culturally transmitted ability, it really only takes a single generation to irreparably alter the character of a nation for the worse.
Despite the novelty of your democratic experiment, it seems possible you humans will live to improve it. Political tolerance is one way of finding your way to strength. There has to be an open exchange of ideas and interpretations. If you find that there are voices being silenced, you must fight to make room for careful public analyses, lest your satisfaction of their absence be the weakness in your armor.
That's very poetic, Mickey. Practice encountering things that are difficult. This has become a refrain over the last few episodes, but there's really no other way of going about it. You have to do hard stuff. Take cold showers, grow a garden, get fit, read lots of books, learn to code, make music, have difficult conversations with people you don't like, learn to ask forgiveness and to forgive. Become someone who doesn't just tolerate difficulty, but becomes stronger for it.
That'll help you get ready for the hardest fight of all. The one for a democratic republic that actually represents you. We'll go into that in another episode, but There's always voting systems, term limits, campaign finance reform, corporate regulations, and so on. Just know there's a lot of ways to improve what you've got going on right now.
Definitely. In the meantime, please join us on Facebook for discussion and subscribe.
Do it.
Don't miss next week's episode, where we pivot away from social science and take a look at the pursuit of anti-gravity technologies. What a switch. Don't get whiplash. If you liked today's episode, share it with your friends so we can continue to grow the demystifying community. Your support is literally the most important factor in recruiting the best conversations here on the spaceship.
So enjoy the conversation that follows with Dr. Ben Guillet. Leave your ideas in the comments section and tell us what you think about the rise of strongmen in recent years.
We read every one of your comments and absolutely love hearing from you, really. Even criticisms.
See you next week, my humans.
Bye.